Good morning or good afternoon to those in other time zones, and welcome to the last of the three CLE panels hosted by the CARES Clinic at Villanova Law in conjunction with our Tech Futures convening. Thank you all for joining us today. My name is Frances Kramer. I'm the current director of the CARES Clinic, teaching alongside adjunct professor Tanya Valdez. We are thrilled about today's panel, International Perspectives on Digital Identity and Migrant Surveillance. Before diving in, we'll see if there's anyone from Just Futures Law who would like to say a few words. I don't know if we have anyone here with us right now, but maybe at the end of the convening, we might hear from them. I'll start then with a few quick announcements. If you have any questions during the program, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of the Zoom screen. We will get to as many questions as we can at the end of the program. For those of you licensed in Pennsylvania, there is one free CLE credit available for this panel, thanks to a generous gift from our donor, Joseph Azrak. We will also provide out-of-state certificates to those who request it in the CLE registration and evaluation form, which was sent to you from Eventbrite and will also be linked in the chat. If you are seeking CLE credit for this program, you will need to fill out a course evaluation. In the course evaluation, you will be asked for 2 secret words to help verify attendance. Those words will be given out during the program, and it is your responsibility to write them down. Per the Pennsylvania CLE Board rules, Villanova is not allowed to share the words with you if you miss them. If you have any questions about CLE credit or other logistics, please use the Q&A function. Lastly, we have created a resources page with links to relevant articles and other information related to the topic of this panel. The link to the website will be posted in the chat. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce our moderator for this panel, Professor Jaya Ramji Nogales. Professor Ramji Nogales specializes in immigration law, international law, procedure, and process. She currently teaches civil procedure, evidence, refugee law, and policy in the Temple Law Asylum Project. Professor Ramji Nogales' research areas include asylum and refugee law, global migration law, and empirical assessment of asylum adjudication. With that, I'll pass it over to Professor Ramji Nogales.
Thank you so much, Frances. I'm really delighted to be here, and thank you for putting together such a wonderful panel. So I'm going to introduce my 3 terrific panelists, and then I'm just going to ask them questions and I'm excited to hear what they have to say. So in alphabetical order, first we have Petra Molnar, who is a lawyer and researcher specializing in migration, technology, and human rights. She is the Associate Director of the Refugee Law Lab at York University and splits her time between Athens and Toronto. She is currently working on a project studying the human rights impacts of AI and automated technologies on migration control with the European Digital Rights Initiative. She's worked on forced migration and refugee issues since 2008 as a settlement worker, researcher, lawyer, and holds a Juris Doctorate from the University of Toronto and an LLM specializing in international law from the University of Cambridge. Our next speaker is Grace Mutungu, whose work revolves on the intersection of technology, human rights, and culture. She researches tech policies in Africa and has an interest in digital rights, digital governance, and digitalization. She was a 2016 to 2017 Open Technology Fellow at the Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society at Harvard University, studying information controls at election times in Uganda and Kenya. She is an associate of the Kenya ICT Action Network, where she carries out policy and legal advocacy. And last but not least, we have Santiago Narvaez, who's a researcher at R3D based in Mexico City, which focuses on defending digital rights in Mexico. Narvaez surveils the people who are surveilling us by researching privacy and surveillance. When he is not taking requests for information or analyzing databases, he composes music and plays midfield in the R3D soccer team. So welcome to the panelists. I'm looking forward to our conversation this morning. So we'll start with a question on identity technology surveillance, and migrants. So what we've seen is that as countries around the world adopt digital identity verification and surveillance policies, there's a real risk that this shift will serve to further marginalize vulnerable populations, particularly migrants. Can you talk about the ways in your experiences in which digital IDs and or surveillance have exacerbated the exclusion of migrants within the territorial borders of a destination state? And feel free to jump in, whoever wants to take that first. I'd love to hear from all of you on that one.
I can jump in if that's all right with everyone. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for having me. I'm calling in from Athens in Greece. And my work really sits more along the issues of the surveillance of people on the move and people who are crossing borders. And it does touch a little bit on digital identity as well, but what we're trying to map out in the project that I'm currently doing is precisely what you just said, Jaya, the kind of impacts on people's lives as they're moving across different borders. And also, though, to situate it in the kind of political economy context that gives rise to why surveillance is happening. And I think, again, that context is really important and the environment is really important because across the world, we're seeing a rise of increasing anti-migrant sentiments, xenophobia, and a turn to techno-solutionism, as opposed to, humane processes for asylum procedures and immigration issues. Unfortunately, more and more states are looking at these really sharp edges of technological development and oftentimes testing them out on populations on the move that have been historically marginalized. So in my work, I'm trying to understand it from a global perspective, but Greece has become a bit of a case study for us, somewhat accidentally because the pandemic really messed with our broader research agenda, and it's really difficult to do on-the-ground research with people who are on the move during a pandemic. But in Greece, it's been more possible. So I do visit the frontier refugee camps here. I was just on Lesbos Island actually last week to talk to people and see how they're impacted by surveillance. And the last thing I'll say is it really is a growing phenomenon, particularly around these frontier regions, perhaps similarly to the US-Mexico border that I'm sure we'll discuss as well. But the frontier edges of Europe are really a free-for-all, a bit of a Wild West experimentation zone when it comes to tech. And I'll leave you with one example. Just yesterday, it was, I think DW News and the Associated Press reported that the Greek authorities are using a sound cannon against people who are crossing irregularly across the Turkey-Greek border. And this sound cannon is an incredibly violent piece of technology. Yeah, perhaps it's not surveillance, but it is still technological violence. And it's completely unregulated. And the fact that this can happen on European Union soil is really disturbing.
Grace, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, I mean, not to really start from the issue of territorial borders, but from the issue of how policies are exported, and to relate it to what Petra was talking about. If you look at all the countries in Africa, most, if not all, are now implementing digital ID in their countries. And this is coming from the World Bank and from the development agenda. It's coming packaged as part of the Sustainable Development Goals, that everybody needs to be counted. But when you really look at the tentacles of how it works, it starts by being a requirement for you to have digital ID in order to access services inside your country. And then whenever you want to go out of your country, you also need the same digital ID. It is as if now for you to go out, you need to have a digital personality, a digital ID that is assured by your government. So, now we are seeing a lot of digital identities everywhere, but for those of us who, had the privilege of traveling, it started a while back that, to get a Schengen visa, you had to give your biometrics. Then other people picked it up, the government started picking it up, and they'd say, to get a passport or to get out of the country, we need your biometrics. And it's now going to more and more functions. To get food aid, we need your biometrics. And then when you go to the humanitarian agencies, they're even more into the whole biometric identification game plan. It started with refugees. If you want money, if you want food, let's first have your biometrics so that we can confirm who you say you are, and so on and so forth. So I agree with Petra that there's a lot of techno-solutionism, even when there's no problem. It's just applying technology everywhere, and it's a very ambitious project to count everybody in the world.
Thanks, Grace. And interesting to see the way that plays out differently, maybe in the global south and the global north as destination states. Santiago, did you want to add anything, or should we move on to the next?
Sure, briefly. Thanks for having me. I think that digital ID, and especially in the case of biometric identification, gives governments and also private companies a lot of faculties to exercise surveillance. As the process of ID verification happens by comparing registries that are contained in state databases. So in this way, when we are buying goods and we are required to identify ourselves with this kind of digital identifications, the state is tracking all those movements from us. So, and also as the private sector gathers more information about us by the use of these digital IDs, the government can also have access to this information, which can then be used to track people, to harass minorities. And this is already happening for example, in the US, the ICE, which is the Migration Enforcement Authority, is already using public and private databases to track migrants and to deport them. So we can expect that with the uprising of these digital IDs, this process will be even more, I would say, generalized. Also, going back a little bit to what Grace was saying there is also the issue of conditioning access to services, to public services, and to the exercise of rights to the ownership of these IDs that is worrying. In Mexico, for example, recently we just passed a law that is going to require the users of mobile telephones to give their biometric data and identify themselves when they are buying a SIM card. And this is expected to have impacts on minorities that are not registered or do not have access to these IDs, such as migrants, which will impede them from having access to telecommunication services. And this is worrying because we have seen that the use of for example, the access to Facebook, to WhatsApp, to internet, to other tools, it's helping a lot migrants in their way to in the region to get into their destiny, and also to coordinate, to access information, which is really opaque, the government information. So these are some of the issues that I see in the adoption of these digital IDs. Thank you.
Great, thank you. So now moving from, as Petra previewed a bit, moving from the destination state to the border itself, right, the use of AI at the border obviously has very troubling implications for migrants, both for identity and for surveillance purposes. Can you talk about some of the most urgent and problematic issues you currently see with the use of AI at the border? Petra talked a little bit about sound cannons, which is pretty shocking. What else are you seeing happening now that gives rise to real concerns?
Yeah, I mean, perhaps I can jump in. I mean, the border as a concept is a problematic one, right? That I think we need to unpack rather, from perhaps an abolitionist perspective or an open borders perspective, but also from the legal perspective. When it comes to decision making, a lot of the decisions that are rendered by human officers are opaque, discretionary, and hard to scrutinize. And so imagine now augmenting or replacing some of them with automated decision making or AI. And one of the most, really for me, visceral examples of this are the pilot projects that have been springing up around introducing AI lie detectors at the border. For example, the Border Control project, which was a pilot project in the European Union space in Greece, Hungary, and Latvia. Latvia is a bit of an outlier, but Greece and Hungary, fascinating because they're major interdiction points for migrant movement into Europe. And you know, I'm not really a digital rights person. I'm a refugee lawyer by training, so I'm going to put that hat on for a second. And you know, think about like the issues when it comes to trying to unpack someone's credibility in a refugee claim is already difficult enough, and it's rife with biases and discrimination and issues that humans struggle with when it comes to plausibility and credibility. So now imagine that we're playing around with decision making that is somewhat automated or fully automated. How can an AI lie detector deal with differences in cross-cultural communication? I've represented people that don't feel comfortable making eye contact with a decision maker of the opposite gender. And that's seen as, you know, oh, well, they're probably lying because they're not looking at, you know, me in the face. Or what about the impact of trauma on memory? And the fact that we know that people don't tell stories in a linear way anyways. How stressful would it be to face an AI lie detector at the border? I mean, it's incredibly dehumanizing and violent. And yet, massive amounts of money are being dumped into a project like this. And we have to ask why. I mean, it's just one of many, many examples that we've been trying to track and understand in the border space when it comes to automation, but it is a really worrying one. And again, the fact that the European Union funded this, and even Canada kind of tried to get in on this and tried to think through another version of this project. So this is a global thing, and it is really, really worrying. And for me, probably one of the most visceral examples of how this can go wrong.
You know, just to follow up on that is the question of who makes the AI and what traditions or what truths are fed into that AI, because you find it's mostly from not even the whole of the Western perspective, but a certain Western perspective. Forgive me for any white males, but it's usually the white male perspective, which means, you know, that what the AI looks for would be a very narrow perspective. And so you find that as far as relations are concerned, for example, you know, in my culture, the word cousin means something totally different from the Western perspective of culture, because, you know, if it's patriarchal, my father's people, you know, they take the same names as, you know, I'd be calling what you'd call cousins, I'd be calling them my brothers or sisters, you know, or something like that. And so you find that usually when people are doing, let's say, visa applications, these are people who, you know, are trying to go for conferences to share perspectives. It is almost as if you have to get out of your own skin and imagine yourself to be from another culture in order to answer those questions correctly. But you find that what you answer in, for example, that interview is first of all shared with other agencies, and then you never get to know about this. But secondly, it is what is used to make a decision on whether you can travel or not. And most of the time, I think a few years just before the COVID pandemic, there was this scandal of the all these awesome top of the cream African data scientists and machine learning people who could not attend a conference in Canada because the AI just didn't find them worthy of a Canadian visa. Yeah, yet, these are spaces where, people are meeting to expand science, or they are meeting to talk about the same problems in AI. So you find that the fact that we don't, we do know who makes the AI and what kind of traditions and cultures are fed into the AI and train the AI, that becomes problematic because it does not represent a person who does not come from the culture where the AI was made. So the overall effect is that it can be very, very discriminatory against any other person who's trying even to do, to go through the straight and narrow door of going to get a visa so that they can travel, according to the rules that have been set.
I agree with what the other panelists have said regarding the opacity that we are facing. Also, in the case of Mexico and the use of technology for surveillance in the migrant context, we are facing a lot of opacity, not only from how it's been done, but also from the companies that are selling these products, and also from how the Mexican migration authorities share the information with migrants about the use of these technologies. We see that many times migrants are pushed to sign for their deportation without knowing they are signing for this. So we can expect that the use of these other technologies will happen in the same manner. We have asked many times through FOIA requests to the Mexican authorities about the use of other technologies such as drones and biometric identification, and they keep on replying that they are not using such technology. So there's a lot of opacity there. And yeah, another issue that is related to also what Grace was saying is that it's especially worrying the bias and the errors that these technologies have. In the case of facial recognition, we are seeing that the system tends to have more errors in people that have darker skin or that are young or women and also elderly people. So we can expect that these kind of errors will impact more migrants. Also, regarding the adoption of AI systems in decision-making, there is the biases on the algorithms that we are seeing in other types of these technologies, such as policing prediction and justice procurement, have resulted in disproportionate accusation of minorities. So it's worrying to leave this kind of decisions, such as the one of granting asylum to these kind of systems when we are seeing they are having errors. I would also say that in this equation, at least in the Mexican context, we have to add the fact that the line between the government and the organized crime tends to be a lot blurry. So many times the Mexican authorities and the organized crime share information, they work together. So we can expect that the use of these sophisticated technologies will also end up being used by the organized crime, which is super worrying.
Yeah, terrifying. I have to say, when Biden said he was moving to smart borders, I think I'm a little more terrified, and you guys have given reason to be concerned about that. All right, so for the CLE attendees, the first code word is identity. Identity. The first code word is identity. All right, so moving from the borders, I'd like to think a little bit about containment and the way the role that technology plays in containment. So for folks in the audience who aren't familiar with the term, in recent decades, governments in migrant destination states, particularly in the global north, have engaged in strategies to prevent humans from moving across borders and externalizing their borders, with the U.S. externalizing its border into Mexico so that migrants don't even make it to the U.S. and trying to keep them where they are and keep them from moving. So a couple of questions there. I'd love to hear more about how technology is being used to amplify these containment strategies. That we kind of think of containment as boots on the ground, but obviously technology is doing work here. And in particular, what patterns are you seeing, right? So the governments are comparing strategies and sharing them and replicating them across different countries. And I think you've already touched a bit on this concern, but I'd love to hear more about this replication of technological containment strategies.
I don't mean to always be going first, and I'm so sorry about my cat. She really cares about migrant surveillance, so she's with us. Yeah, I mean, containment and detention issues and the kind of rise of carceral logics, the way that they're playing out in migration, I think are really, really important to think about, because I think issues around criminal justice or carceral justice and migration justice are linked, and we have to think about them holistically, because globally speaking, you're absolutely right. I mean, we're seeing the rise of, physical walls, surveillance walls, smart borders, turning towards detention, and even other policies like border externalization or pushing borders further away from their physical location through the use of technology. And in the European context, a lot of illegal pushbacks where people are returned to a country that they were coming from, often Turkey or Libya, which is illegal under international law and in direct contravention of various legal principles. But again, I mean, I think it's to go back to a point that Santiago was saying, the private companies that are involved in the way that this kind of containment strategy is playing out is important to think about, because there's a lot of money to be made when it comes to immigration detention and border enforcement. And again, like you say, I think different regions learn from each other. And in the EU context in particular, it's been fascinating because last fall in September, the EU released its new pact on migration. And if you read through this rather lengthy set of documents, it's really, really key that containment, border enforcement, something called the Europeanized return process, which I guess is all about deportations, is really, really peppered throughout the document. And the way the technologies play into it is it just legitimizes and makes easier these logics and these practices that entire regions like the EU, for example, are turning to. And it is quite disturbing.
I also don't mean to go second, but I immediately thought of how it's playing out in the post-colonial states, because, for example, in Africa, the borders were quite arbitrary, and sometimes communities that, before colonialism were moving across borders were now told that, after this part, you're now in country X, and on this other side is now country Y, and these are two totally different countries. And, in the post-colonial period from the 1960s, there were nation-building projects and issues of ethnicity and politicization of ethnicity played out. So in countries like Kenya, you find that we have this problem of border communities that really had problems getting citizenship documentation. And now we are moving into digital ID, which requires you to have citizenship documentation in order to get the digital ID. And a very interesting case is also the Somali people who are the border between Kenya and Somalia, where in the late 90s, early 2000s, there was a big drought. And there was also civil war in Somalia. So there are refugee camps on the Kenyan side of the border. But so people went there to get food because it's one of those underserved areas, and everybody who went there to get food from a certain time had their biometrics taken. And then later UNHCR shared that database with the government of Kenya, and so now there's you know, a couple 100,000, I mean, like, I don't know, 40,000 people who are Kenyan and they claim Kenyan citizenship, but they're in the UN refugee database, which without their knowledge or consent was shared with the government of Kenya. But when you think about the whole issue, it just brings about all these issues of, you know, getting everyone to have some kind of permanent identity, yet identity is fluid. You know, for thousands of years, people have been moving to areas where it's more, where their life can flourish. It's only human to move to the area where your life can flourish. So if food is being offered at the refugee camp, if there's better healthcare at the refugee camp, you will go there, right? Because you want to survive as a human being. So it's really interesting. This case is being looked at. It's one of the key issues that advocates of against statelessness have put to the government of Kenya, because the government of Kenya at the same time wants to close all the refugee camps. And you can imagine what would happen if digitally you're considered a refugee, even though physically you're a citizen of this other country. And, you know, at one point, everybody in the refugee camp is told, go back to Somalia, yet you have never even been to Somalia. But all this is out of use of technology and you know, recording biometrics and taking that register as the single and only truth about you, that it does not matter what else you say, what has been recorded is the end of the story. So yeah.
Thank you, Grace. Somehow you managed to answer a question that was put into the chat while you were talking. I'm not sure what kind of ESP you have about UNHCR and identity. So well done. Santiago, did you want to add anything about containment?
Yeah, sure. More on the patterns that we are seeing and the replication on policies. In Central America, there's like kind of a saying that this replication of policy gets to a degree that the Central American countries do not have a migrant policy, but they have the US migrant policy applied instead. And we are seeing some of these patterns, for example, in the emerging of migrant prisons in Mexico that are so-called migrant stations, where when migrants are applying for asylum, they need to stay in these stations without being able to going out for the whole process, and this can take for months. You know, we are seeing this also in the US. We are also seeing what it's called sometimes the strategic bureaucracy, which is like changing regulations and the process and hiding the information from migrants so that they get exhausted and they end up not asking for asylum, for example. But we are also seeing the replication of rhetoric by criminalizing migration. In the last decades, the position towards migration has shifted a lot towards criminalizing and portraying migration as a national security threat instead of a humanitarian crisis, right? And in the case of technology, we are also seeing this replication in policy. Although the adoption of these technologies is happening in a higher rate in the global north, we are also seeing the adoption of these technologies in countries in the global south, like Mexico is using biometric identification, the use of drones also. But I will also speak about the differences in how surveillance technology is being used, because it has to do with the context of each country. For example, in Mexico, there was a case in which activists and migrants who were participating in the caravan and who were part of a process of asking humanitarian visas ended up in an FBI database afterwards when they were trying to ask for asylum in the US. So this is showing that there's like that Mexican authorities and US authorities are sharing information. A little bit like what is happening in the relationship in the US between federal and local authorities, where the local authorities provide information, they provide facilities and human resources to federal authorities, who in turn the federal authorities provide information, know-how, and resources for surveillance. There are also cases where US surveillance drones detected migrants in the Mexican border and told Mexican authorities to catch the migrants.
Thank you. I wanted to encourage people, if you have questions, to put them in Q&A, because I have questions that can keep us going till the very end. So unless you let me know in the Q&A that you have questions, our experts here have a lot to say. So please do drop a question into the Q&A if you have something you'd like to ask. So Grace touched a bit on colonialism, and then it's kind of forward-going impacts through borders. I wanted to talk a little bit to hear from you about neocolonialism and tech governance. So the important point of this panel is to really expand the view of the audience beyond the US. And there's a real concern that some of you expressed that many policies relating to technology and migration are made in Washington or Brussels and then enforced through aid or trade packages. So can you talk to me a little bit about technology policies that are imposed from the capitals that are really concerningly distant in a lot of ways from the populations they seek to regulate, and talk a little bit about your concerns about these policies and the location of their formation and application?
I mean, this is one of the things we could talk about the whole day. For example, when the World Bank started funding, they call it ID4D, Identification for Development, and everybody else, or they started based on the Sustainable Development Goals. But the way it's done, it's changed from the goal of giving everyone legal identity and counting everyone to expanding the power of the state. Because now legal identity has to come from the state. And if you're at the risk of statelessness, you're now kind of in a rat race to do whatever it takes to get whatever documentation you need in order to get, in order to be counted and to have some document. Yet, and for the sake of everybody who's attending today's panel, a lot of people are not against some kind of identity. The world has become more open. For example, in Africa, everybody is looking for, more movement of people across the continent. And so previously, for many years, since the 60s, African leaders or thought leaders have been calling for something that would help Africans to be able to move more freely across the continent, because believe it or not, it's very difficult to move around Africa with all the rules that that were left. And so you find that when people come up with these ideas in Washington or Brussels, again, they think about it in terms of a certain Western conception. So they think that the problems that will occur are things like data protection. We need to protect the data. We need the technology to make sure that all the technology companies can come in and be the providers. So they were making standards or guidelines on some of those issues. How it escaped them that they first need to deal with issues of statelessness before they deal, because if SDG 16 is about inclusion and not leaving anyone behind, anybody would say then the first thing you need to deal with is statelessness. Let everybody belong somewhere, and then you can give them identity. But you can see that there's a lot of applying technological solutions and thinking that the first thing you need to do is to open the market for technology companies to come in and issue or help the government to issue this kind of identities. The next thing you need to do is to change the law and make it mandatory for everyone to get an identity, a digital identity. The next thing is to link the digital identities to services and so on and so forth. So that kind of top-down approach is so problematic, and I wish if there had been some inclusion of all the bottom ideas and solving the structural issues that are existing before we go to applying technology.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, just to expand on some of that, absolutely, Grace. I think, this kind of top-down, neo-colonial, ahistorical, anti-structural approach to the way that borders and movement is playing out now really needs to be interrogated. And in the European space, I mean, the kind of trickling down of particular policies that get rendered in Brussels and the way they play out and the way they're tested out in the frontier states, not just in Greece, but also Italy and Spain and countries along the kind of frontiers of Fortress Europe, rather. There's a huge discrepancy, and you see politicians talk about, again, Europeanized asylum process and closed containment camps, and even going as far as, I was at a press conference with one of the commissioners from Brussels, and she kept saying things like, well, Turkey is our friend and they are supposed to be the ones who are, managing the flows of migrants. And she flew in on a helicopter and did a 20-minute visit to the refugee camp, and now she's known as the helicopter lady in the camp. So I mean, that is just the perfect example of how disconnected the leaders and policymakers are from the way that these issues are playing out on the ground and in people's lives. And it's really, really depressing, because again, in reality, the EU is choosing to fund 5 new closed containment centers and essentially detention centers and camps on the Aegean Islands closest to Turkey. So on the one hand, they're talking about humane processes, and on the other hand, this is how it's playing out.
Yeah, in the case of policies being developed from top down and their disconnection, I think the policies that are developed in these capitals, we're seeing that they tend not to respond to the real needs of the global South countries, but to the interest of the global North countries, and they are using like this, global South countries to be like kind of vertical borders to stop people from asking for asylum. So these policies tend to lack, to take into account problems such as infrastructure, or knowledge shortage, social and political issues, such as the presence of organized crime also, and institutional weaknesses. In the case of Mexico, we have the early adoption of the biometric identification technology in the migrant context in 2011, which biometric kiosks were donated through the Merida initiative to the Mexican government, and were out of use because it took like about half an hour to register someone, and they didn't have really the infrastructure to share the information, so it was not even used. I think it's also important to think about the dependence that the use of this technology imposes on governments, where, for example, the use of databases are operated by transnational companies that charge for query services and for maintaining such databases for the posterity. So governments need to keep contracting these companies and there is not knowledge transferring, so the countries cannot develop their own technology. There's also the issue of extraction of information as a factor that many times the companies are using, for example, the Mexican faces. In the case of facial recognition, we have some examples of companies like, for example, Dawa, that is providing the system for facial recognition and then using the Mexican faces to make their systems work better in identifying these kinds of populations, and then they are reselling these systems to the Mexican government. So we are seeing the extraction of information also as a neo-colonialist relationship.
Thank you. So for the CLE participants, the next secret word is surveillance. The code word is surveillance for CLE folks. And again, encouragement to drop any questions you have into the Q&A. Otherwise, I'll keep proceeding with my questions. The next thing that I would love to hear from all of you about is about the role of corporations. Of course, when we think about international law, it's traditionally thought of as states. But when it comes to technology and migration, obviously corporations play an enormous role. So I'd love to hear from you about the role that corporations play in creating, and Santiago touched on this a little bit, the technology policies that are then imposed by Washington or Brussels. And I'd also like to think about, right, since we're dealing with corporations rather than states, are there different leverage points that we might use to try to influence their participation in technology strategy, right? For example, right, these corporations are made of employees who might be more amenable to shaming, or they might have concerns about, and we've seen this happen in the past, they may have concerns about the way the technology they're working on is used. So I'd love to hear from you on either or both of those points.
Sure, I can jump in there. Yeah, this is a very important piece of the puzzle, this political economy that has grown up around the development and deployment of tech. And, you know, big tech is waiting to make big money in migration management technologies. And that's really, really clear. But the problem is that when you are trying to figure out how to understand responsibility and mechanisms of redress and what this is to look like, when you're dealing with public entities like states, using private entities to develop and deploy technology, it gets really, really muddy, right? Because there is now this over-reliance on part of public administration bodies to use the private sector to help develop tech, because they don't oftentimes have the in-house expertise to do it themselves. But of course, states have very different obligations than the private sector when it comes to human rights, to accountability, to administrative legal principles and all of that. And the concern is with this responsibility laundering, the people whose rights and lives are affected fall in the middle, and they don't have adequate mechanisms of redress, oversight, and accountability. But I think it's also a broader philosophical question, perhaps, about whose priorities matter, right? And if we know that the private sector stands to, you know, support its bottom line, it's very clear there's a reason why we're developing AI lie detectors to be used on refugees and migrants, and not using AI to, I don't know, like root out racist border guards. Whose priorities really matter when it comes to development and deployment? It's clearly the private sector in this space.
I can jump in. I think companies have a central role in the adoption of these technologies, as they have a great influence, not only through lobbying, not only in the decisions that are being taken in higher levels in government, but also in portraying the rhetoric or the narrative around the issues such as migration and turning them into social and into security threats. We are seeing that private companies are being extensively consulted in laws regarding the use of surveillance technology in Mexico and in the rest of the world, supposedly because they have the know-how, and in these consultations, the governments are not consulting, for example, human rights experts also to balance, to find a balance. We have also the issue of revolving doors that needs to be considered as a factor of this, that many times people from the government and from the private companies end up in the government or in the private companies, like changing their employment. And also through this tunnel, companies are shaping the rhetoric and narrative regarding migration. We also need to consider I think the role of corruption and the relationship between the private and the public sector in these surveillance acquisitions. There are a lot of cases, documented cases in the procurement of surveillance technology that are showing that there are ties between authorities that bought surveillance and the companies that sell them. It is usual to find that these technologies have like exorbitant prices because they are also including commissions that are given to government officials, and we are seeing that kind of things. In the topic of lobbying, we know that Amazon and well, companies like Amazon and Palantir are lobbying in order to circumvent local legislation or to push the adoption of policies that benefit such companies. There is a Migentes report that speaks about this, and it says that the Congress members were received around 250,000, sorry, my God, contribution from Amazon and other tech companies who participated in a partnership to codify a federal regulation about IT acquisition. So yeah, that's it.
I feel like I also need a cat, but I don't have one in Hi to the Cats. Just one further point to add to the great points that have already been given by my co-panelists. It's just the issue of market intelligence and how companies are gaining market intelligence by participating in government digital ID projects or datafication projects. And so you find that sometimes they even come in, through the development partners. And sometimes it even looks like, this is being done as part of technical cooperation or almost as a gift. But it is not. And for that, I think we need to investigate this notion of the novelty and the innovativeness of technology, that it is so new and only well known out there. So you people down here in Africa or in the global South need all the help you can in order to move forward, whether that help comes even in the form of somewhat exploitative or extractive stuff.
Great. So we have about 5 minutes left. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to wrap up a couple of questions that came through the Q&A that go to solutions, which is where I was going to head. Anyway, so how are migrants and their allies using technology to fight back? And what are other solutions? So there's a question about fighting back against extractive surveillance, but more broadly, what can migrants and their allies do? What are they doing? What are kind of the global conversations that are happening? And then another question about what should happen. Should there be regulations? Should there be government oversight? Should there be technological solutions, right? So all of those problems that you laid out in nearly an hour, give me your solutions in a minute or less.
Sure, maybe I can jump in because sometimes I'm the most depressing panelist because I look at the sharp edges of surveillance, right? I don't often look at the ways that technology can be used to move the world forward in good ways. But for me, I think the most important thing that's missing, I mean, other than, of course, all the other things that the question itself noted, regulation, oversight, accountability, is actually talking to affected communities and centering the lived experiences of people who are experiencing surveillance, who are at the front edges of automation, and including them in conversations when it comes to developing and deploying policies. Because right now, I mean, it's a lot of lawyers and academics and civil society talking to each other, but what we are missing is the communities themselves driving technological development. And because otherwise, again, it's all about replicating existing power hierarchies, and that really needs to change.
Thanks. And I'm going to add in another great question that just came into the Q&A, which is about how we can keep connecting the local struggles, fighting the use of technologies, and building international solidarity and collaboration.
Okay, thanks. So on what we can do, this is really important, also talking about it and exposing the problems, because there may be a few good companies who may want to do the right thing, but are in the wrong rooms, and they never get to hear these conversations. There's also, a lot of, which may happen to all the students here, a lot of people from the West who come to work on these projects in Africa and other global South places, and they are absolutely not aware of other nuanced issues on the problem. And so that cannot be overstated. And to the last question, there is the hashtag YID movement. I'm going to type it once I'm done here. That tends not brings together. It's organized by an NGO called Access Now. It brings together activists or digital rights advocates who are working around issues of digital ID, and it's really interesting because people are able to talk to each other, share experiences, support each other. For example, when activists are taking up strategic litigation and so on. So I'm going to type it in right now.
Great, thank you. Any last words from you, Santiago?
Yeah, sure. As the context of migration has shifted, and with the introduction of surveillance technology and the shifts in policies that I was telling you that has happened in the Central American context, we are also seeing that migrants are adopting the use of mobile phones, of social networks to get organized. For example, the caravans made extensive use of social networks to get organized. Actually, it was a flyer that started to go around in social networks that gave the path to the first caravan. And later on, we have seen that migrants have been using chat and blogs to get information about government. And also, it is important for them to have access to this technology in order to maintain communication with people in their countries and in the destiny countries, as this is like a tool that serves them to cope with the psychological partnership that they are facing. They also are using this technology to find about safer routes, places to find shelter, to find food. But we are also, sadly, we're also seeing that these means are being used by the government authorities to surveil migrants. There are cases where infiltrated police officers have infiltrated into these chat groups, and they have used this information to arrest innocent people. And to in El Salvador, that there was a case that a farmer and two other persons were arrested after they participated in one of these chats. So we're seeing that we are also, that this use of technology also comes with risk. And this has to do with what we can do. I think there's like a big need for to focus on capability development inside migrant organizations and also directly with migrants regarding good practices in digital security, and also to let them know how this technology works, how are they using it, and I don't know what can they do to redress their abuse. There is also another topic about how this technology is being used to disinform people and to take out of context some cases about migrants. So we could also explore the capability development in case of sharing information and misinformation.
So I just want to say a huge thank you to our panelists. We're a little bit over the hour, and I know folks may have to go, but I did want to give Paramita Shah from Just Futures a chance to say a couple of words at the end, and really just a huge thank you to all of you. We could have gone on all day. I would have loved to hear more from all of your expertise.
Thank you. Thank you. This panel has really been instructive for me. I am grateful. And I'm really actually very pleased that this panel in particular marks the end of our Tech Futures Conference. And so grateful to the panelists for bringing their enormous expertise and vision to this conversation. Most of our work is done in the United States, but we have been watching what's been happening here, and the massive threat posed by extractive surveillance is a global one. And hearing about, I think, the strategies, the challenges ahead, I think informs the analysis we need to cultivate in the United States to really, I think, even put in a dent to what we face, to communities that live here and communities abroad. It's that to me that we say we live in an age of global data, celebrate globalization, and have such a distorted response to how we deal with migration. So thank you for coming today. We have a number of reports on our website at ourtechfutures.com, and you can take a look at it. Most of it deals with data brokers and companies and fusion centers, things that I think are being replicated across the world as they are in the United States. But I look forward to staying in touch. I wanted to thank our Take Back Tech fellows, Francis Kramer and Tanya Valdez, who are blacked out on my screen, but put really all the work in having this trio of CLEs come together. So thank you for staying on. Thank you for being a part of this conference, and I'll see you around. Thank you. And thank you, Professor Ramji Nogales. It's really good to see you.